All right, ladies and gents, welcome back. So, we've been having this discussion over the last couple of lessons about cell transport, moving materials in and out of the cell in order to maintain that homeostasis. Now, up to this point, we've really been focusing on transport that doesn't require your cell to input any sort of extra effort. No energy has to get expended. It's all based on concentration gradients and that idea of your cells trying to reach that state of equilibrium. And so they're going to move materials from where they're high to where they're low um, based on that concentration gradient. And then the question just becomes, is it going to be something that can move straight through the membrane because it's nonpolar? Or do I need to do some sort of special transport, like facilitated transport using the proteins, or if I'm moving water specifically about osmosis, moving through proteins because they can't go directly through the phospholipid bilayer itself. Now we're going to move our discussion away from that passive transport where I don't need energy into the discussion about active transport. And in order to move anything actively, that means energy has to get utilized in order to do some sort of work. In this case, we're talking about that transport work. So we're going to start today really talking about this idea of just energy in general. And when we define energy in a scientific standpoint, we're talking about utilizing energy to perform some type of work. And when we classify energy, we classify it really as the first two categories, potential versus kinetic, and then the chemical and thermal energy fit within them. So if I take a look through these different types of energy, what are we talking about? So with potential energy, this is energy that is stored energy, and that energy is stored either based on an object's location. So if it's really high, like this guy at the top of a hill, or a person at the top of a staircase is another common example. They've got a lot more potential energy, more energy to do work really based on falling, based on gravity and acceleration due to gravity. As opposed to being at the bottom of the hill or the bottom of the stairs, where you're a lot closer to ground level, and so there's less um, ability to fall, less distance to fall, and so less being acted on by gravity. That's sort of more the physics side of things. For us as biologists or moving into chemistry, you're going to look a lot more at potential energy based on an object's structure. So we'll get into a little bit about chemical energy in a couple seconds, and that's where this is going to fit in for us. Kinetic energy then is just the energy of motion. So I'm now, instead of storing the energy, now I'm using it. So that person going down the hill, somebody walking down a set of steps, or in this case in the image, height potential, height differential by somebody sliding down a water slide. All right, the potential energy is heightened at a higher position at the top of the slide, and that kinetic energy, that downward motion, happens as they come down the slide, and that's the kinetic piece. We're going to focus more on this side of things, right? Potential energy or chemical energy due to the bonds and the arrangement of atoms in a molecule. As we break those bonds, rearrange those atoms through a chemical reaction, we're putting that potential energy into kinetic energy and rearranging that. So when we talked about endothermic and exothermic reactions, that's really how much potential energy do I have stored in the molecules in my reactants to start the chemical reaction, and then how much kinetic energy do I get back out once the chemical reaction finishes. In an exothermic reaction, I get a lot of kinetic energy out in the back end. I get a lot of energy to go use somewhere. In an endothermic one, I actually have a really high potential energy and not a lot of kinetic coming out when those bonds get broken. That's why we needed those enzymes to help speed up those chemical reactions. Now, heat is a form of kinetic energy. You may also come across it as thermal energy. We feel it as temperature change, right? So the more that those molecules or atoms are moving, all right, the more kinetic energy they're producing, and so they give off heat as a byproduct of that. So when we talk about these chemical reactions in your body, if they are very exothermic, meaning they're giving off lots of energy, your body temperature goes up and you feel it as heat. Chemical energy is the potential energy stored in the chemical bonds that are holding molecules together. So if we wanted to sort of rank it, something like a hydrogen bond, which is between molecules, has very low potential energy, and so it's easy to break. Your ionic bonds are somewhere in the middle. Your covalent bonds are the strongest. They have the highest amount of potential energy, but they're also a lot harder to break. But we go through that chemical reaction, something like burning gasoline in your car, or we'll talk about cellular respiration and burning up sugars to make energy. All right, all of that, converting that potential energy into new molecules, the actual chemical reaction process itself is utilizing then that kinetic energy, and a lot of it comes off in the form of heat. So your cells really are doing their best through cellular metabolism, so photosynthesis and cellular respiration, those two big metabolic processes, utilizing and making ATP. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is your cell's currency. It's its energy currency. It's its energy money. And your cells have to spend this ATP in order to do all sorts of work. And that work can be moving things around. It can be making chemical reactions happen. But a lot of processes require energy, and this is the way that your cells are able to do it. So what we look at is, here's adenosine triphosphate. Remember, it's a modified nucleotide. So here's your ribose, that's your 5-carbon sugar, your nitrogenous base in this case is an adenine, and rather than having a single phosphate like a traditional nucleotide, you've got 3 of them. That's where that triphosphate comes from. And what your cells are going to do is they're going to take this ATP that they're building, they're going to go through a hydrolysis reaction. So we're going to add water, and we're going to pop off this phosphate. And in the process of doing this overall chemical reaction is exothermic. So I get all of this excess energy out when I actually pop off that phosphate. So they often talk about these phosphate bonds as being high energy bonds, because when I break them, I get a lot of energy back. And what your cells will then do is to couple this energy and this free-floating phosphate and do this process called phosphorylation. They'll add that phosphate group to some other molecule. In a lot of cases, it's protein, and we're able to then use that to change that protein shape and make it do something. So ATP is used for all sorts of work. We can do it through chemical work, so add that phosphate to something new. All right, pop it off, and now I've got enough energy and a bond to make a product. Here's the mechanical work, so something like motor proteins in your cells walking along your cytoskeletal fibers, and they'll often have molecules or organelles attached to the back of them, and they'll literally attach that phosphate. It'll change its shape when it pops off, change its shape back when I put it back on, and we're able to make these motor proteins move. It almost looks like hands pulling on a rope, which is pretty cool. We've been able to watch that under some electron microscopy images, which is pretty neat. And what we're talking about in this unit is this transport work. So adding and removing those phosphates changes proteins in your cell membrane, and that's going to be able to allow us to move things from one side of the membrane to the next. So it's all about that phosphorylation. Adding that phosphate will cause the protein to have one shape. Removing that phosphate will cause the molecule to change shape and to do something else. So that constant shape change, right, allows us to do things. Now, ultimately, your ATP in your cells really is going to work as this big cycle. So we're going to be really on this side of the cycle for now. So taking that ATP, breaking it down, removing that phosphate, using that energy and that phosphate to phosphorylate something else and get some sort of change to happen. But what you end up with then is this adenosine diphosphate, so ADP, so 2 phosphates instead of 3. But if all I'm doing is spending energy or spending money, right, eventually your cells are going to wear out and run out. And once that ATP is gone, the ability to do any sort of cellular activity stops. So, we're eventually going to talk about, when we talk cellular respiration photosynthesis, we're going to come to this side of this cycle where now I'm going to take this ADP energy from things like sugars that you're eating so that I can add that phosphate back on, recreate the ATP, and be able to keep moving things around in my cells, keep doing work in my cells. So it really is one big cycle. So this is sort of the transport and work side of things. And this is where your metabolism comes in, being able to regenerate that so that your cells continue to have energy to do things that they need to do.